It is my great honor to be able to invite Dr. John Ikerd up to the podium today to share with us a bit about his journey. He is retired from University of Missouri back in the early 2000s, and he's raised on a small dairy farm, worked in private industry, and has held several other academic positions prior to returning to Missouri. He's been doing this work for decades and has just a really rich perspective on where organic has come from and what we need to consider for the future. So, Dr. Ikerd.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, some people say at my age I appreciate the opportunity to be anywhere, but actually I do appreciate, and I really want to express my thanks to the organizers. Ginny and Brooke have just been excellent to work with. I always like to start off by saying that what I say is my truth. It's my perspective on the Reconnecting, or the roots of organic, here today, the title of the conference. And if your perspective is different from mine, then that's all right. You know, we're going to hopefully leave some time at the end of this session that you can get up and state your truth if it's different from mine. I'm old enough, made enough mistakes. I don't take my truth too seriously because I might change my mind over time. You know, our truth is a reflection of our life experiences, and we can't go back and change what's happened in the past, but we certainly can do things that help reshape the future. We can't control the future, but we can do our part of it. What happens in the future is not totally up to us, it's up to other people and it's up to nature. And we have a responsibility to work with both of those, but we can do our part. And that's what I want to talk about today, is how we do our part. Now, I'm going to read a bunch of quotes because I want to go back to what I consider to be my truth, the roots of organic. And I don't want you to think that I'm making up stuff that I quote these people as saying, so I'm going to read it and we'll go through fairly quickly. And as I say, if you have questions about it, we can come back and pick it up later. But from my perspective, I think the philosophical foundation for real organic was laid in a series of lectures back in 1924. The modern organic movement, anyway, was laid in a series of lectures by Rudolph Steiner back in 1924 when he talked about biodynamic agriculture. And he wrote, and he said, central to biodynamics is the concept that the farm is healthy only as much as it becomes an organism in itself. An individualized, diverse ecosystem guided by the farmer who's standing in living interaction with the larger ecological, social, economic, and spiritual realities of which that farm is a part. To Rudolph Steiner, the farm is a living organism, and the farm is a part of that. And Steiner was concerned that the agriculture that we had in 2024 was not only threatening not to feed the physical health of people, but not to feed the spiritual health. Sir Albert Howard of the UK is sometimes quoted considerably in the organic farming movement. I think he laid the ecological foundation in the landmark book of 1940 called An Agricultural Testament. In that he wrote, he said, the maintenance of fertility of the soil is the first condition of any permanent system of agriculture. In the ordinary process of crop production, fertility is steadily lost. Its continuous restoration by means of manuring and soil management is therefore imperative. And then he added, he said, the agriculture of ancient Rome failed because it was unable to maintain the soil in a fertile condition. And he went on to say, the farmers of the West are repeating this mistake that was made by imperial Rome. And he finished up by asking the question. He said, can mankind regulate its affairs so that its chief possession, the fertility of the soil, is preserved? He said, on the answer to this question, the future of civilization depends. He talked about a permanent agriculture to support a permanent society. Many of you may be familiar with J.I. Rodale, the organic gardening magazine that started off, and he was the publisher and originator, founder, and publisher of it, and started in 1942. And the organiculturist is what he called organic farmers. He said in the organiculturist creed, he said the organic cultural farmers must realize that in him is placed a sacred trust, the task of producing food that will impart health to the people that consume it. As a patriotic duty, he assumes the obligation to preserve the fertility of the soil as a precious heritage that must be passed on undefiled and even enriched to future subsequent generations. He laid the social and the ethical foundation for organic farming. He called farming is not just an occupation. Farming is a calling. It's a mission. It's a sacred trust. It's a patriotic duty. That's what farming is all about. Real farming is all about. And the work of these people that I've talked about up to now was paralleled by George Washington Carver. He lived in a time of a segregated society, so his work is less appreciated and often ignored in the mainstream organic farming movement of the time. But he was working in the early 1900s in parallel with these other people. George Washington Carver is often credited for his work on peanuts and sweet potatoes, but he wrote and researched on crop rotations, how to maintain soil health, and on composting. And he talked about soil fertility as being essential, and talked about how communities ought to be able to feed their families and feed their communities as well as produce excess for the rest of society. George Washington Carver held a graduate degree from Iowa State University and founded Tuskegee University, so I'm sure he was aware of what these other organic pioneers were writing and what they were talking about, and I suspect they were well aware of his also. But he talked about learning from nature. He says we need to learn from nature, not just about nature. He said reading is fine, but if a person walks in the woods and listens carefully, he can learn more than what is in books. Learn from nature, follow nature's pattern. These people were all talking about and learning from people that had come before them. We went back to Hiram King. He was with the U.S. Soils Department at the time in 1902, 1904. He visited Japan, Korea, and China. He wanted to find out how the farmers in those countries had been able to maintain the fertility of their soil for many centuries without depleting it. So he went and studied it. And when he arrived in China, he wrote, he said, we had gone from practices that within 3 generations had exhausted strong virgin fields. He was talking about we've gone from the U.S., from America. And he says we're coming to other fields still fertile after 30 centuries of cropping. He wrote it in a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries. And mainly what they were doing, they were getting everything that left the farm come back to the farm. And the law of returns is something called it. And so they continually regenerated. So they regenerated the soil health over and over again so it remained productive over time. Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was dean of the College of Agriculture at Cornell University at that time, the land-grant university in New York. He wrote the foreword to King's book. He said, here in North America, we're wont to think that we may instruct all of the world in agriculture. He says, we have really only begun to farm well. In those days, the land-grant universities were beginning to see the problems of declining soil fertility, and we're beginning to do research and education on how to restore fertility in what I would call sustainable agriculture back in the early 1900s. He says the first condition of farming is to maintain soil fertility. And he talked about how our productivity depended upon farming out soils and then moving on to new soils. Unfortunately, the wisdom of these people was denied. And in fact, when we talk about Bailey and the others, they really wouldn't have had to go to China and Japan and India to learn how to farm sustainably if it hadn't been for slavery and genocide in this country, having wiped out the cultures of Native Americans and the African Americans that came here. They knew how to work with nature and maintain the fertility of the soil and pass it on from generation to generation. They had done it for centuries as well. They understood that they went into nature to get their food, and they could do like other species within nature, could tip the ecological balance in their favor but from what they got from nature, they had to give back nature, because if they tipped the economic balance too far, they would destroy the life and the health of that system of which they were a part, and they would destroy themselves. They could meet their needs for food, fuel, and fiber and do it in a sustainable way. To them, nature was sacred. It was a responsibility. It was a matter of stewardship, the same basic organic principles that the others were discovering later on. Unfortunately, the wisdom of the indigenous people and the early organic pioneers wasn't heeded, as we know now today. And most of you probably here in Kentucky, how many of you read The Unsettling America, 1977 by Wendell Berry from here in Kentucky? I encourage you to read it. I think it ought to be required. When I first got interested in sustainable agriculture, that was one of the first books I read. Wendell Berry talked about all of the things that we talk about with the degradation of the soil, the destruction of rural communities, the destruction of society as a whole, caused by what I now call the industrialization of agriculture: specialized, standardized, consolidate, fewer farms, larger farms, dying rural communities. He said that if agriculture is to remain productive, it must preserve the land, the fertility and the ecological health of the land. The land that is must be used well. If the land is to be used well, the people who use it must know it well, must be highly motivated to use it well, must know how to use it well, must have the time to use it well, and must be able to afford to use it well. In other places, Wendell wrote about the farmer must love the land, love the farm that they're farming. And I would add love the neighbors and the people that they're working with within the local communities. He's known for what I call kind of the connectedness, the need to reconnect not only with the land, but with local communities and with people in society in the local communities. And there were others within that period of time that were working and really learning from from the early pioneers, but also from indigenous people. Alan Savory, holistic resource management, came to the U.S. in the 1970s. He developed his planned grazing system by mimicking the wild animals movements in Africa. That's what the indigenous people had done throughout history. They had lived among those wild animals, but they also moved the animals and moved with those animals in the managed grazing system. And he went back to basically to Rudolph Steiner, and he was saying that the farmer should move toward and work toward an interconnected system, a holistic system, and work toward a single holistic goal that is ecological, social, and economic in its dimensions, but inseparable in this three-part goal. And there were other people like Wes Jackson that talked about mimicking native prairies. Talked about permanent agriculture. So there's history that we can go back to in the past, but organic farming isn't so simply rooted in philosophy and rooted in what we've heard from the past or indigenous cultures, but it's also firmly rooted in science. And the science of sustainable agriculture, at least is what Miguel Altieri called it, the science of sustainable agriculture, is agroecology. And I contend that agroecology is the science of authentic organic agriculture as well. And the first principle of ecology, it kind of links the science of ecology with agriculture. And the first principle of ecology is that everything is interconnected. Everything is inseparable. Everything that happens among the living organisms in the soil and the relationships between the soil and the plants and the animals and the plants and the animals and the farmers and the farm communities and the farm communities with the whole, it's all part of one single interconnected whole. You can't just do one thing. Every time you do one thing, there's going to be consequences somewhere else within the system. Now, unfortunately, he called it the science of sustainability. Sustainability as a word was kind of co-opted by agribusiness corporations and so on, but it's still rooted in agroecology. The idea of a permanent agriculture, of working with nature to regenerate and renew the productivity of the soil. the productivity of agriculture. That's rooted in the concept of science of sustainability, but also the philosophy of Rudolph Steiner and the social and the ethical foundation, the ecological foundation. It all comes together. And there's more recent people that talked about the application. Booker T. Whatley talked about making small farms sustainable. How to earn $100,000 or make $100,000 on 25 acres. And he talked about the CSAs, the need for farmers to connect with people in the urban areas in order to maintain their markets, but also to have the connectedness between the rural and the urban areas in terms of sustainability. And then there's Elliott Coleman up in the Northeast. Elliott Coleman's probably best known for Four Seasons Farms because he showed that you could produce good produce year-round, even without fossil energy, in addition to doing it organically, even up in Maine. But it was all about small farms and restoring local communities and local foods is what he talked about. John Jevons out in California, biointensive agriculture, said you can produce more than you can possibly think about in your small space in the urban backyards. We could feed the world on a relatively small few acres if we farmed it intensively. Alice Waters in California, farm-to-table restaurants, linking farmers with local restaurants so that you have the whole food system connected. All of today's advocates stand on the shoulders of those organic pioneers, including the indigenous people that had come on before them. You could go on and on and on, and I'm sure you can name people that have influenced you and you feel have an influence as well. But they all stand on the shoulders of these early organic pioneers. You see, the organic farmers were the first to understand the consequences of what I call industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture treats plants, animals, people, all the living things as if they were inanimate mechanisms rather than organisms. It tries to make them behave the way a machine would behave, that you could replace the parts on it, that if it breaks, that you can always fix it. It treats the farm like a factory, not a living system, a whole sequence, specialized, standardized, controlled system. It's inherently exploitive and extractive. It's very efficient at extracting and exploiting the resources of the earth and turning things into economic values. But it's not about renewal and regeneration because those things aren't efficient. It's not efficient to continue to reinvest for the benefit of somebody for the future. It's not efficient to renew and regenerate rather than to simply extract from. It's separate from nature. Or again, industrial agriculture sees nature as a resources just to be used up, and the farm and the farmer is kind of separate from nature. Nature's something to be conquered. If you can't control it, then you have to dominate it and conquer it to the extent that you possibly can. It's about exploiting extraction rather than stewardship and caretaking. During the 1980s, the organic movement would kind of move forward as a part of the sustainable agriculture movement. I don't know how many of you remember the history of this. That's kind of when I became involved in sustainable agriculture, was during the 1980s. And the sustainable agriculture movement was really come out of the organic farming movement. Particularly Robert Rodale of the Rodale Institute had been pushing USDA for years to try to get them to do more with organic farming. During the financial crisis of the 1980s, he was able to form a coalition with people who were concerned about, the farmers that were concerned about going broke at that time because of the high cost of purchased inputs and high interest rates and things of this nature. They wanted to have a sustainable agriculture economically, and then there was rural advocates that were concerned about the impact of the farm financial crisis of the 80s on rural communities, the social dimension of sustainability. And Rodale saw this as an opportunity to pull together this coalition to finally get USDA to do something. And sustainable then was kind of a compromise to try to make organic more acceptable to the conventional farmers who were concerned about the cost of inputs and the rural community peoples. And so the problem is that sustainability focused on the permanent dimension of organic farming rather than focusing on the fact that you had to have a healthy living system in order to have a permanent agricultural system for a permanent society. The so-called industrial agricultural establishment, they saw sustainability as, here's an opportunity for us to kind of greenwash our tarnished image over the years, because we can take this idea of sustainability and we can turn it into something that we can accommodate, and we can make a case for continuing doing what we're doing. Sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. They said, you've got to have an efficient agriculture to meet the needs of the present. And by the way, we'll come up with new technologies that deal with the environmental and social problems for the future. So you've got to put your money on industrial agriculture. We can fix it up a little bit and we can get some new technologies, but that's your only hope for sustainability. Earl Butz said, the Department of Secretary of Agriculture said, he said, before we go back to organic agriculture, somebody is going to have to decide what 50 million people we're going to let starve. As if organic farming couldn't feed the world, organic farming was feeding most of the world and still feeding most of the world today. But that was the argument. Only industrial agriculture is sustainable, and that's what you hear today. When they talk about sustainable intensification, they're just saying, well, we can learn to do industrial agriculture better. We will produce more, we'll pollute less, we'll use fewer resources. You may slow down, but if you're going in the wrong direction, just slowing down isn't what you need to do. You need to turn around and go the other way. But anyway, in spite of all the opposition from the industrial agricultural establishment, organic market continued to grow, rate about 20% per year during the 1990s. Well, the mainstream food system gets interested anytime you're growing anything at that rate. Their market grows about 1 or 2% per year because that's what the population, or they can get people to consume more per year. So if they got a segment of the market that's growing that fast, they're going to get into it. And they did, and the corporations come in, started buying up the more successful organic farming operations around the country, started doing their own. And they farm for the economic bottom line, not the ecological, social dimension of agriculture. It's all about economics. It wasn't about a way of life. It wasn't patriotic. It wasn't sacred. It was a matter of economics. And so we saw then in the early 2000s, or actually in the late 1990s, you begin to hear about the need for organic certification. So we have to have standards. Why is that? Because up to then, you had different organic standards scattered around the country because the organic standards fit the particular region of the country and the people that were farming there. But they convinced a lot of people in the organic community, we've got to have a single standard. This is confusing. It wasn't confusing to the people that knew their farmers, and it wasn't confusing to the people that did in the region. But you couldn't industrialize it. You couldn't specialize, standardize, consolidate. See, I talk about specialize. You have to standardize things before you can specialize, and then once you standardize and specialize, you can consolidate them into larger and larger operations, and that's what they did. The organic pioneers saw the flaw in this back in the 1970s. Eve Balfour in the UK was one of the early leaders, and she said, the techniques of organic farming cannot be imprisoned in a rigid set of rules. She said, organic is included in it's epitomized by the outlook of the farmer, she said. Basically, what she was saying is that the integrity of organic production depends upon the integrity of the farmer. You can't write rules that will ensure that. And sure enough, she's right. What we did once we got the standards in place, and once you have them out there and have them lined out, and it says, whoever can meet the minimum standards at the lowest cost then is going to contain the market. They're going to grab the market and they can take it. And they figured out ways that they could do that in terms of meeting the standards, at least to the extent that as they gained a larger and larger share of the organic market, then they gained a larger and larger impact on setting the rules of organic, and they continued to whittle away to make rules less and less interference with the industrialization agriculture practice that they wanted to carry out. And so today we end up with a large portion of our total produce is produced, and more of it will be produced in so-called certified organic operations that don't even have soil. all I've said about organic farming being rooted in soil fertility and soil health. The large hydroponic operations, there's no soil involved, but they're still certified as organic because they have the political power to change the regulations so that they could do so. They have a large percentage of the eggs and milk, for example, is produced in large factory farms, confinement animal feeding operations where the animals never see the ground, hardly ever eat a piece of grass. That's not organic, folks, but it's part of the organic label today, and that's the consequence of when you start running any system focusing on the economic bottom line rather than including the ecological and social considerations as well, or those bottom lines as well. So that's what we see today. Now, organic has continued to grow, and it takes about 6% of U.S. food sales today, even after all of the growth industrialization. Local foods, USDA says, is about 1%. I think it's probably more than that. But you could really say organic and local together, still probably less than 10% of the overall market. So as we look ahead, then you'd say, well, the challenges are pretty daunting. All of this time, all of this effort, we still have less than 10% of the total market. But it's not hopeless. I'm not saying the challenges are easy to overcome, but it's not hopeless. Because there's growing awareness. There's growing awareness that there's something fundamentally wrong with certified organic. I think certified organic is a step in the right direction. You can buy food that doesn't have the pesticides and the other chemicals associated with it, and it's not genetically modified, and it's not a lot of other things, and they're still pushing for humane standards. But anyway, so it's a step in the right direction, but it's not a permanent agriculture. It doesn't have the ability to continue to grow over the long run. There's the Real Organic Project that has something close to 1,000 farmers that have signed up to it. It said the purpose of the Real Organic Project is to grow people's understanding of the foundational organic values and practices. It says crops grown in soil and livestock raised on pasture are fundamental to organic farming. It's an add-on label, certified organic plus, we're saying livestock raised on pasture, crops grown in soils. There's an organization in the European Union called Natureland. They have 140,000 farmers that's similar. It's an add-on label to the UK standard that goes beyond what they say on that standard, trying to reestablish sort of the integrity of people that really want real organic product. So that whole movement's moving forward as well. There's a whole global movement around agroecology, which I mentioned earlier. Agroecology in the international arena is a main contender with this sustainable intensification, which are do industrial better. They pulled together in 2017, there was an international panel of experts on sustainability associated with the United Nations. They cited over 350 different reports and reached these conclusions. They say today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food to global markets, but are generating negative outcomes on multiple fronts. Widespread degradation of the land, water, and ecosystem, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity losses, persistent hunger and micronutrient deficiencies, alongside the rapid rise in obesity and diet-related diseases, and livelihood stresses for farmers around the world. And they concluded what's needed is what's required, they say, is a fundamentally different model of agriculture based on diversified farms and farming landscapes, replacing chemical inputs, optimizing biodiversity, and stimulating interactions between different species and parts of holistic strategies to build long-term soil fertility, healthy agroecosystems, and secure livelihoods. They go on to say the data shows that these systems can compete with industrial agriculture in terms of total output, performing particularly strongly under environmental stress and delivering production increases in places in the world where additional food is desperately needed. Diversified agroecosystems can also pave the way to diverse diets and improved health. The leader of that organization came out in a press release after it, and he says, it's not a lack of evidence. They cited over 350 scientific reports to support their conclusions. He says, it's not a lack of evidence that's holding back the agroecological alternative. The way food systems are currently secured allows a value to accrue to a very limited number of actors, reinforcing their economic and political power and their ability to influence the government on food systems. Simply tweaking industrial agriculture will not provide a long-term solution to the multiple problems it generates. We must change the way we set priorities, political priorities. Nowhere is that more important than here in the United States. We need a fundamental change in U.S. farm policy. We need the Farm Bill was initially set out in 1938. The first Farm Bill was about supporting family farms as a way to take care of the land and provide food security. And by the way, the first Farm Bill that was declared constitutional in 1938 was actually an amendment to the Soil Conservation Act that had been passed in 1935. It says that it's a legitimate public interest to keep farmers on the land as long as they're committed to maintaining the health and the integrity and conserving the productivity of the land over the long run. The first Farm Bill was a sustainable agriculture bill, if you will, and basically that farm policy continued in that direction up till after World War II. After World War II, then the technologies that came out of World War II looked like you could industrialize agriculture, realize all the economic benefits of industrialization with the chemicals. You could control the pests and fertilizers. You didn't have to deal with crop rotations and things of that nature, and cheap farm tractors. You could do away with horses and various other things, and so you could really make the farm work like a factory, and that would make it more economically efficiently. And so in the 1960s and 70s, there was a fundamental shift in farm policy. We can go back and, look at that period of time. That was the period of Nixon, Butts, and others that came in, farm fence row to fence row, we're going to feed the world. And basically what they said, if we apply the principles of industrialization, specialized, standardized consolidation to agriculture, we can make it much more efficient. We'll make good food affordable to everybody, and that should be the farm policy of the future, and that's what's been driving it as we got into the future. The technologies that came out of World War II made industrialization possible as we know it today, but the policies made it inevitable. And those policies are still in place. The policies were well intended. I bought into that whole model through the first 15 years of my academic career until I began to see the fallacies in it. It was well intended. I thought we were going to make good food affordable to everybody, but we didn't. It failed. It didn't provide food security in the country. We have 1 in 9 people that are classified in the country, the latest statistics, that are classified as food insecure. 1 in 7 of our children live in food insecure households. That's a larger percentage than there was back in the 1960s, in spite of generous government programs and food assistance programs since that time. It didn't feed the hungry people. In addition to that, it's destroying the ecological environment and totally destroying and decimating our rural communities and rural economies all across the country. It was well intended, but it failed, and it's time for a change in farm policy. Good news is that there's people working for change, not only at the local and regional level or state level, but also at the national level. There's a bill Cory Booker is involved in, it's presented time after time. It's the Farm Renewal Act, which is calls for a moratorium on factory farms, a transition away from factory farming, restoring competitiveness in the agricultural sector so at least you can get back to markets. And so there's a movement going on at that level. There are other proposals that have been made. The Green New Deal came out. There was various proposals. I was involved with one that was put out by Data for Progress, where we talked about regenerative, a Green New Deal and regenerative farming. What we said is you need to subsidize or support, accept the risk of family farm incomes. That's what the first Farm Bill was about, supporting family incomes on par with non-family income. So why not shift the crop insurance and convert that into family farm income insurance for those that are willing to make the transition or begin farming with sustainable regenerative systems. Shift over the research and education programs of the land universities and elsewhere, like we did back in the 1960s and 70s, but shift it toward a regenerative, sustainable agriculture. The technical know-how for replacing industrial agriculture with sustainable, regenerative organic systems, the technical know-how is further progressed today than was our know-how and the technology of industrial agriculture in the 1960s. We know more about how to replace industrial agriculture than folks knew about industrial agriculture when they replaced the traditional family farms. Regardless, things are not likely to change at the state and federal level, but they can certainly change at the local level. We can do things within our local communities and rather than simply wait for changes at the federal level. There's a food sovereignty movement that we could put on. It's a global food sovereignty. It declares the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate produced food through ecologically sound and sustainable practices, and their right to define their own food systems and food and agricultural systems. Agroecology provides the foundation for that. I've written and proposed the idea of having community food utilities. Let's use public utilities to ensure the rights of people within our local communities, that everybody has enough good food. So we need to move in that direction. But regardless of whether you produce for local markets or we just produce for your family or wherever you produce for, you need to reconnect with the roots of organic if you're concerned about the long-run sustainability of agriculture and your contribution to society overall. And that requires an organic worldview. A farm is a living organism. A farm is a living system, an agro-ecosystem. We can tip the balance of agriculture or nature in favor of us relative to other species. Every species within nature does that. Every species attempts to tip the balance in favor of them to other species. But we can't tip it too far, or we'll destroy the integrity of this living system with which we are a part and upon our life and livelihood also depends. The Romans made the mistake. The Mayans made the mistake. Other civilizations have made the mistake, and we're doing the same thing. The main difference is our system of industrialization is encompassing the whole globe. There's no place else to go. We need to get it right this time. We need to go back to the roots of organic farming. The farmers are a part of the system that they manage. They're part of the biological and the bioregions and the ecosystems of what they're a part, and they have to farm in balance, in harmony with the living systems on the farm and the living communities and the bioregions of which they're a part. You know, the best way I can bring this about is to relate it to the human situation. You know, if we as human beings, there's a part of us that's this conscious or what they call stonomic, I think it's stomatic nervous system. That's what we have control over. We can control our muscles and our movements, which way we look and things of that nature. But there's many things, the critical things in our body are the unconscious or autonomic nervous system that controls the beating of the heart and the brain and the lungs and the digestive system and that sort of thing. We can consciously affect the breath rate and things of that nature by what we do, but we can't control the rest of that. We can influence the health of our body, but we're not in control of it. Nature's in control of that. We're part of nature. We are part of the great plan of nature, and a big part of the functioning of our body is beyond our control, not beyond our influence, but beyond our control. The farm manager also is a part of that. He can influence the way the farm operates, but you can't control it. There's a part of the farm that's controlled by nature, whatever the laws of nature, the higher order of things, by God or whatever you want to call it, that's controlling the parts of that farm, and it's moving in a direction, and maybe you can guide it in one way or another. And you're a part of that. You've got a place here. You have a place to fit within that, but you're not in control of it. So the farm is a part of a larger biological community. In the same way, the community is controlled by other people, but it's controlled by the forces of nature. And you can influence what happens in the community, but you can't control it. Management's not that. And a community and society as a whole, and it goes on up, you have to work to live in harmony and balance. Our conscious decisions have to be consistent with that of species that have a place within a healthy natural ecosystem that lives in harmony and balance. And farms are part of that community. That's what King and Howard and Carver, that's what they were talking about, a patriotic duty, a sacred trust, realizing we're part of something bigger. You know, if we manage farms as living systems, they will be sustainable. The ecological part will be sustainable. Natural systems are naturally regenerative. They regenerate, they renew themselves in healthy natural systems. Healthy natural systems are naturally resilient. They have the ability to withstand shock. They have redundancy that's built in. They have their own immune system. They are resourceful. They work together. The waste of one becomes an input to another. They're very productive in terms of resourcefulness, regenerative, resilience. Those are the essential dimensions of sustainability. Those are the roots of organic farming. It's there on the farm. They're diversified, individualized, decentralized in control. They're not specialized, standardized, consolidated. Living things have selective boundaries. They let certain things in, they keep some things out. That's the way a farm has to be. Sustainable farm's not in isolation. It feeds society, but the law of returns, it has to bring back to replace what it takes out. It has to be selective and open, not open to everything, don't let anything in, everything out. That's the way a living systems function. Living things grow. They're conceived, they live, they grow, they reproduce, and eventually they die. A sustainable farm is the same way. You conceive, you grow, you nurture it, but it has to get to a point where it reproduces. There has to be another generation of farmers that come onto that farm if it's going to be sustainable, because old farmers will eventually die. The farm has to reproduce itself. I could go on and on and on with the analogies between farms and living systems. Nature can take care of its part. You're responsible primarily for the social part and the economic part. Those are also a part of nature, but that's where your influence is. And you can learn from nature, as Washington Carver said. Learn from nature how to be regenerative, resilient, resourceful, and how to be sustainable. Those are the roots of organic. You know, that's basically what we're talking about here. You don't have to go back and develop it all from scratch. There's a whole range of farming systems out here that include these principles: holistic, ecological, biodynamic, real organic, natural, agroecology, permaculture, food sovereignty. Choose whatever fits you, and then go ahead and adapt it to yourself, to your farm, to you and your community. Make it work for you, but remember that you're dealing with a living system. I think the greatest challenge of organic farming sustainable is for the farmer to realize that they can influence but can't control that system. The seductiveness of industrial agriculture, it creates the illusion that you're in control when really you're not. Nature eventually will fight back. But you have to realize that nature is controlled, a part of it. You have to work with nature. The life of the farmer is part of the life of the farm. The farm has a life of its own, and you're a part of it. And the life of the farm is a part of the life of the community and part of the life of the whole on earth. And it's part of the soul of the farm. The farmer's soul is a part of the soul of the farm, which guides the farm in some direction. The natural part of it, it guides the farmer if he'll follow what nature is going to take us to. It's connected at that higher level that Rudolph Steiner talked about, of being a spiritual connection. That's what gives us our sense of purpose. Some people question whether there is any purpose because you can't prove it, but without purpose, life makes no sense. There's no way of know right from wrong or good from bad or what you ought or ought not to do if there's no purpose. The farmer's life is a part of the life of the farm, and the farmer's soul is a part of the farm, soul of the farm, and the soul of the farm is a part of the soul of the earth. That's what guides us toward a greater good for the future. Will we succeed? I don't know. Wendell Berry's response, he says, we don't have a right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have a right to ask is, what is the right thing to do? What does the earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? It requires that we reconnect with the soul of the farm, that we reconnect with the soul of the earth. That's what Steiner and Howard and Carver were talking about. Reconnecting with the roots of organic is reconnecting with the soul of the earth. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I think we finished about on time, and we've got time for questions. I want to say begin with, I'm old and hard of hearing, so if you want to ask a question, you need to raise up your hand and get a microphone so other people can hear you, but so I can hear you as well. So if somebody's got a question, or if you want to make a comment, that's fine. If you don't agree with me, that's probably good. You get another perspective people would get, okay?
Yeah, I believe totally with what you're saying, and manage the whole farm as a whole and improve the whole landscape of the farm and the spirituality of it all. What do you think of a thread running through the farm that's even taken to a higher level of management, more intensively managed for the ecological services and the delivery of those services throughout the land?
Well, I think the kind of the ecological part of the farm is really the foundation of it. If you think about it, everything that's any use to us as human beings ultimately comes from the earth. It comes from the soil, the air, the water, the energy. There is no place else. So everything that's of any use to us or any value to us, including everything of economic value, ultimately comes from the earth. If we destroy the productivity of the earth, there's no source of anything else. Now, beyond that, if you want to go beyond self-sufficiency, which I think we're social beings and we really need to for necessity, but we also need for our quality of life, then it means that you have to relate to other people. If you want to have something more than you can get directly from the earth by yourself, then you have to start working with other people. And that's the reason we've had families and tribes throughout humanity, as far as we know, even going back to the first humans on earth. They went together. So we have to depend upon society then to get the things from the earth. The economy is simply something that we created so that we could get things from people that we didn't know, that we didn't have to be restricted to what we could get from people within our own circle of friends or within our own community, that we could have impersonal economic transactions. And so we tend to get preoccupied with the economy. I say this as an economist because I think at my age I understand the basics of economics about as good as anybody that I've heard talk about it anyway. But we get preoccupied with the economics and we forget everything of economic value has to come from earth by the way of society. And if in our seeking ever greater economic efficiency we destroy the integrity of our society and our earth, there's no way to sustain the economy. So it starts with the foundation, but you can't just focus everything on nature because we have to meet the needs of society, and in a complex society, then we have an economy. So you have to make it all work. But I agree that the ecological foundation is the one we have to respect because we can change the culture of society and we can change economic rules, and we need some big changes in our economic rules, but we can't change the laws of nature. So those are the ones that we have to accommodate, and we have to adjust our society and our economy to conform to the basic laws of nature. And that's what I was trying to say. We can learn from nature how to do things regenerative, resilient, resourceful. Other question?
Thank you very much for sharing your passion about all of this with us. The work of yours that I'm most familiar with is the concept of food as a public utility, and you mentioned that just
Right.
in passing. Could you just, I want more people to know about this, so can you just explain that concept to folks in the room?
Very briefly, and anybody that's interested in, I'm following up with me, I've got quite a bit of information out there. I've tried to been working with different communities. I've never got one to really go all the way through it, even though I've worked with them for quite a long time. But what I've argued, it goes back to the basic idea of food sovereignty, and I believe this. I believe every human being, regardless of their ability to contribute to the economy, has a right to enough wholesome, healthful food to support, active, healthy lifestyle. I think that's a basic right. It's not a privilege. It doesn't something you give to you. You don't have to write a grant to get it or whatever. I think you deserve that as a basic human right if we want to have a civilized society. And food sovereignty goes beyond that and says that if you're going to have that, then every community has to have a right to determine their own food system and their own production system, and has to be able to determine that. Well, that's not the way things function today. But we have public utilities that serve a legitimate public function. And I would argue food security is a legitimate public service because we're already allocating public funds on government food security programs or government food assistance programs, which says that it's a legitimate function of society to take public money and to spend it on this particular cause. And I see providing food then is no different from providing, if we provide electricity, we do public utilities for that, water, sewer systems. All these are public utilities, which basically gives the community sort of a monopoly to decide how the water is going to be distributed, how the sewer system is going to work, and all that sort of thing. The people within the local community decide that. And then it's available to everybody. That's the way a public utility functions. We also have public utilities for things like public transportation. It's not that it goes to everybody, but some people in the community, just like on food, don't have access to transportation, so we have public transportation. And once you have public transportation, then everybody can ride it, but you have it because it needs to be there for some people. And I think that's a legitimate use to say, we in this community are not going to have any hungry kids, at least kids that are hungry because they don't have an opportunity to have good food. And we're not going to force poor people to eat junk food in our community. We're going to have good food, and we're going to produce it by sustainable means. It's going to be nutritious, it's going to be tasty, it's going to be culturally appropriate, and we're going to take on the responsibility of doing that. We're going to have a public utility that does it. And you can take the government food assistance funds that are coming today, and on a voluntary basis, people can say, I'll become a member of the utility. The utility will provide me with good, locally grown, nutritious, healthful food, and will ensure me that I have enough for myself and for my children. And we'll take on that responsibility. And you can take the government funds that go to farmers within that community, and if a farmer is willing to supply that public utility with good food, you can say, give the food in here, and we will ensure that you have an opportunity to farm in a way that builds soil fertility, that's sustainable, that produces nutritious food. We'll take on that responsibility within our community. And that's what I think we're going to have to do eventually. I can tell you again as an economist, if we leave food security to the marketplace, we'll always have hungry people. We claim now that we want to feed the world. Half of our corn crop is going into ethanol. Biggest part of this money, a big chunk of this money that's been coming out from USDA is trying to support the ethanol industry, trying to ingrain ethanol. Also, the large confinement animal feeding operations, connecting methane off of it, putting it into huge pipelines. If we're concerned about feeding the world, why are we going to burn up more and more of our crops, more and more pressure on soil fertility, deplete the soil, use more fertilizers, more pesticides to produce more fuel when there's still hungry people here in our own country and the rest of the world? But anyway, that's enough of my soapbox. But if you want to know more about community food utilities, who's next?
Over here, sorry. Actually, interesting you brought that up because the question that I already had planned to ask kind of pertains to feeding the world.
Right.
A big rebuttal that I get when I've been talking about organic for years is that it's a crazy idea to have small farms that are organic feeding your community, and that we need to have GMOs because without GMOs, we're not going to be able to feed the world's population. And people basically have told me I'm crazy for wanting to stay small and organic and promoting that. So how do you discuss that with people that they just tell you you're uneducated and you don't know what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, tell them to review the facts of the situation. About 70%, at least 70% of the people in the world today are not fed by industrial agriculture. They're fed by small farms, less than like 5 acres. About 50% of the people are fed for about 2.5 acres and on down. But you can see the statistics are online. I've got some of my papers if you want to see that. So, and then the work that's been done in agroecology internationally in South America and Africa and various other places where they talk about these agroecological systems, why I say it's growing internationally, show that you can double or triple the yields on those small farms just simply by basically doing the kind of things that they were talking about in land-grant universities back in the early 1900s, just crop rotating and soil testing, not high-scale technology or any of that sort of thing, just help farmers do what fits in their particular parts of the world, but do it kind of in a way that gives them more information about what's going on in the soil and how crops and livestock fit together and things like this, and then they can adapt their local systems to systems that are more productive. And they're saying 2 to 3 times. If you take 70% of the world that are fed today, even if you want to feed them better, if you double that, that's 140% of total productions today, or the total number of people. If you triple it, then you're up to what? 210%. So you could improve the diets and improve the livelihood of farmers all across the world if we simply transition these programs away from putting billions and billions of dollars into this sustainable intensification, which is nothing more than continuing to subsidize industrial agriculture, just trying to produce more with fewer resources and pollute a little bit less. But every time we try to solve a problem like that, we create another one. But anyway, if we wouldn't put all that money into here and we begin to help farmers in the rest of the world transition, they could feed themselves. We wouldn't have to worry about feeding the rest of the world. We could concentrate on making our agriculture sustainable. That's our challenge, not productivity. We're destroying the foundation for our civilization while we're starving our kids. Other questions? They're not going to have lunch ready for another 2 or 3 minutes anyway, so you've got a question here.
I think most of the people here agree with your if we did this or if we did that, but the politics and the policies, it's hard to imagine that we have a system that's going to provide the political will and the policies in the near future. Right. And will we run out of time before they wake up?
Right. Well, I think what we have to do, everything that I read, and I read a lot of other people and listen to a lot of other people, a lot of people I agree with, even the people I don't agree with, but there are things that everybody talk about that make sense. It always comes back to have to start at the local level. And to me, that's what makes sense. That's where you can make a difference. You can make a difference on your own farm, but you can also make a difference in your own community. What we need, and the reason I keep harping on this, trying to get the community food utility or something like that, it wouldn't have to be organized as a utility. It could be a cooperative, or it could be a nonprofit, or it could be a B corporation, or whatever. You wouldn't have the protection that a community food utility does. But the reason I keep harping on that is that's something you could do within the local community. And if we could have one community within this society where we could say, there's nobody hungry here, nobody involuntarily hungry, we don't have any hungry kids, we don't have any malnutrition, we've got sustainable farms here, we've got healthy soils, you'd create a model that would catch on and continue to grow. And even if you don't, you've created a really good community to live in. And what's wrong with that? As Wendell Berry says, I don't think we have a right to ask whether what we are doing will succeed or not. We simply need to say, what is the right thing for us to do here? What will nature allow us to do here if we want to continue to live on this earth? And then we ought to have the courage to go do it. I'll just wrap up with this. I am convinced that each of us has a purpose in life. I kind of hinted that earlier. I think each of us, you and me and everybody else, we're here for a reason. And I'm convinced that reason is good, that we were put here to contribute to the greater goodness of humanity and the earth and whatever we're a part of. We'll never know the mystery of what we're a part of. But we're meant to contribute to the goodness of that. I call it, we're here to love, because love, I believe, is a belief in the inherent goodness of something. And to love is to act upon that goodness. I think that's what we have a responsibility to do. To act as we feel that we need to do. What is it that we're here for? And if we do our part, if we find our purpose and we live our life and we walk our path to the best that we possibly can, we will have lived the best life that we possibly could have lived, and we will have made the greatest contribution that we possibly could have made to the greater good of humanity and to the future. I don't think we could ask for anything more. So that's all I ask. That's the only reason I'm here today, is I think this is where I ought to be, and this is what I need to be doing. And I hope that's the reason you're farming. Thank you very much.